Okay, it's coming up.
Yeah, we're live streaming.
Okay. 1 minute again.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, Assalamu alaikum, and good evening, good night, or good morning to all of you. We are pleased to have so many people here from all parts of the world, from different time zones. I'm Ashiria Alrud. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a recent graduate from Erasmus University and born here, but actually have grown up in Suriname in the Caribbean. Our regular moderator, Shakira, will return next Sunday. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 289th edition of our ICC Thought Leaders Forum. We wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Girmitya project. Without a single break, 288 weeks straight, we have shown up here every Sunday. In the past 5 years, 7 months, and 1 year, we have featured 1,160 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 288 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Gafur Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. To continue this weekly program and to make it even better and bigger, we are asking for suggestions and volunteers. If you give a donation, your name will be placed on our poster and all the promotional material, so please contact Dr. Mahabir for details about this. Now, we wish to extend our condolences on the passing of Moti Marhe, father of Pavan Marhe, the filmmaker who featured with his cousin Firoz Amir Khan from the Netherlands. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now introduce our moderator today, who is Shalima Mohammed, the co-director of this ICC Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA.
Thanks so much, Ashiria. Assalamu alaikum, namaste, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here with us. This program is being recorded on Zoom and live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. So I want to say welcome to all of you on YouTube at this time. Just a reminder to all speakers, to avoid intrusions from trolls, our IT manager has muted everyone. So speakers, please do not unmute anyone, do not admit anyone, and don't allow anyone to share your screen. Thanks so much for your cooperation. Today, we are talking about a particular topic, reimagining the past, historical fiction on Indian indentureship. And I just want to salute our recently passed Mr. Moti Marhe. Ashiria mentioned that he's Pawan's father, and some of you from South Africa would have met Pawan when we were there in August. But This man is described by Farad Katwaru of Suriname as a great Suriname expert, and now we've lost him. So in terms of historical fiction, he spent a great part of his life putting together films and so on. And his contribution is now there for us to see. And it's being continued by his son. And some of the work that will be discussed today is also going to fill that gap. You see, in this program, writers from the Gomitia diaspora, like Mr. Marhe, uses storytelling to illuminate the lived experiences, struggles, and cultural transformations of migrant communities across generations. We hope to highlight how authors today blend archival research with imaginative reconstruction to bring to life the journeys of indentured laborers who moved across the oceans. These narratives could quite possibly recover silenced voices, challenge dominant histories, and deepen our understanding of identity, memory, and belonging within the wider Indian experience. And it is our honor today to start with Dr. Betty Govindan of South Africa. She's been described as the doyen. She's an honorary research associate in the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She's an academic, researcher, and writer with interests in education, poetry, and theology. Welcome, Dr. Betty.
Thank you. Thank you, Shalima. Greetings, everyone. I'm delighted to be here as a regular attendee, as you know, of our weekly Sunday ICC meetings. But I prefer writing in the chat than giving the lecture. It's also very special having met Shalima and Dr. Kumar in Durban in early August this year. We always felt as family, but it was especially potent and true when we met and embraced one another and the rest of the delegates. I'm going to give a very broad background to indentured literature in South Africa and its various renderings. By the way, I've prepared some 40 pages, and so I'm going to go through this very quickly, and I'm not able to complete the lecture, but Navin, thank you, Navin, will scroll the images so you get a sense of how I'm thinking and trying to bring together different ideas and reflections. I'm delighted that our speakers on the panel, who are writers themselves of historical fiction on indenture, will follow me with reflections on their own writings. Girnitia or indentured literature is a very important literary subgenre in the corpus of South African literatures. As you know, we have different subgenres like protest literature and liberation literature and farm literature, core class literature in South Africa. And indentured literature is one of those subgenres. The history and collective memory of an Indian indenture has provided an inevitable and predictable background for literary writings by South African writers. Of course, you know the history of the arrival of Indians in South Africa, and you know our well-known historians who've written about this. The corpus of literary writings generally focuses on the wave of Indian indenture from 1860. But I'd like to point out that Indians arrived in South Africa long before that, and we can talk about this on another occasion. But there were Indian slaves that came from the 17th century and the 18th century before the introduction of slavery and the abolition of slavery. There's a study done by a scholar at the University of the Western Cape, Parbavathi Ramya, and her study is called A Forgotten Diaspora. And it's actually about slaves who came from India and were part of the Dutch East India Company in the Cape. We also have another scholar, Patrick Turret Mellett, who writes about the truth of Cape slavery and the lie of 1652, a decolonized history of land, which was published in 2020. And these are larger historical projects looking at slavery and indentured histories. And we could look at this at another time. But the important thing to remember is that these historical projects, and especially the writings on indenture for our discussion today, are part of the work of restorative justice in South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you know, looked at the gross injustices during the apartheid era. And this was largely of the 20th century. But the literatures that look at and the histories that look at slavery and indenture in South Africa are very important for looking at our earlier colonial injustices. So I'd like to give you a shopping list, as it were. And the list is rather wide and loose. All the books on indenture, some directly on indenture, and some looking at the afterlives, largely the afterlives of indenture. As you will recall, that is the title of a book by the Nobel laureate Abdul Razak Gurna. And in many ways, indenture is evoked directly or indirectly. So one of our early texts is by Daphne Rook called Ratoons. I have an old copy here. And it's actually, she's a white writer who lived in the sugarcane plantations, drawing from her own personal experiences in a sugar estate in Natal called Long Acres, and writing partly from historical understanding, partly from information she gathered from the Indian laborers who became her friends, and partly from her imagination. We then have a writer called Agnes Sam. Her book, Jesus is Indian, is a collection of short stories, a collection of biographical, autobiographical stories. And she has written one of the pieces called And They Christened It Indenture, which actually draws from her own personal background of her grandparents and also what she found. And as she says, my grandfather was shanghaied as a child from India to South Africa in the 19th century. And she writes mainly about this as a lost history that she discovers. A number of writings took place after 1994, which, as you know, marked the transition to a democratic state. But before that, there were a number of texts not dealing directly with indenture, but using the terminology of coolie and using the background of indenture. So we have Coolie Doctor by Dr. Gonham, an autobiographical piece. We have Coolie Location by J. Naidu. These were all struggle activists in the 20th century. And J. Naidu himself, apart from being a struggle activist, was also a member of the early Democratic Parliament. We had Cape Town Coolie. J. Naidu writes about living in the Separate Group Areas Act of Pretoria. Cape Town Coolie, where Gould writes about living in District 6, which is also about separate development, apartheid, group areas. And then, of course, we have the Rise You Coolies in 1996, looking at the apartheid impact on the Indians in South Africa. I wanted to also suggest that even though there were texts that didn't write directly on indenture, there was the background of indenture to these novels. Certainly the one by Imran Kavadia, one of our better known writers in South Africa, published in 2001. Incidentally, I've written reviews on several of these texts, and if anyone would like these reviews and essays and chapters, I'd be happy to send them to you. But Imran Kavadia is actually writing about two intrepid travelers based much on his grandparents and the way in which they see Africa and South Africa as the empty land, terra nullius. And it's also about passenger Indians, and in living in Durban and in Grey Street, how passenger and indenture Indians, the divide actually blurred, and they were living cheek by jowl, much against living against the colonial discrimination of the early 20th century. Then in 2002, I'm giving this chronologically so you can see how we received these texts and how we engaged with them. In 2002, we had The Lotus People by Aziz Hassan, again writing about passenger Indians, writing about the Durban Casbah, and then going back to looking at the lives of passenger Indians across 4 generations. The other text that came out in 2003 was by Prabha Mudli, The Heart Knows No Color. And here, this is a historical fiction set in the indentured era, and it's also looking at cross-racial relationships, transgressive love relationships on a sugar plantation in Verulam, Natal. And we look at different aspects of this kind of historical fiction and what kind of criticisms may emerge from it. There is another book by Pat Poovalingam called Anand. I have a picture of the husband and wife there, but if you can see it from my screen, this is the actual book. And again, it's a period piece about a young lawyer, the grandson of a coolie indentured immigrant laborer, and about his life in the latter part of the 20th century. There's the story of Maha by Sumaya Lee, again set in the 70s and 80s, but using, in many ways, indenture as the historical backdrop. As she says in the book, our ancestors, some came before others, some were indebted laborers, and others were tradespersons. Why not Africa? After all, it was just another piece of empire pie. Then we had in 2008 the Song of Atman, which was by Ronnie Govender. He's written several plays, and this was a autobiographical piece. It was really related to his uncle Chin, coming as an indentured laborer, and he looks at the way in which his uncle traveled across South Africa in search of work, in search of a safe space, in search of home. And of course, in the midst of his toiling, the sound of music, his favorite Carnatic songs that journeyed with him. We then have, on your screen is the Anand book, and one that follows is the one by Sumaya Lee. Then we had Rubendra Govender, who wrote Sugarcane Boy in 2008. And again, an interesting historical fiction set in the cane fields in Inanda in the North Coast, and writing about a 3rd generation indentured family. And again, indentures at the background, and this is about young boys and what it means to learn to live together. An Indian and an African young boys working out their camaraderie. Then we had in 2008 Givmid Tales. I've written an extensive review of this as well by Neelan Govender, and he was a medical doctor and collected stories from patients, and these were all related to the early life of indenture in South Africa. So in some ways, fictional, but also drawing from real life experiences. In 2009, we had Fiona Khan's The Reeds of Wrath. Again, this is another historical fiction set in the time of indenture and looking at the theme of love across the color line. That's the writer there, and she's holding her book. In 2009, we had Aziz Hassan writing The Revenge of Kali. Remember, his first novel was The Lotus People. Revenge of Kali, again, is a very interesting journey into the past of indenture. It starts, if you like, in the present or in the near past, in the Casbah. And here is a character called Thiru, wanting to know about his past, and goes to the cane fields outside Durban, listens to the cane fields, and hears the echoes of the stories of his forefathers, especially his grandfather Elephant. And then, of course, you have them coming back into the Casbah and looking at the harsh reality of their lives in the present time. An interesting set of plays is by Ashwin Singh, and I wanted to just share with you one of them, which is called Ryoka Light. Again, I've written an extensive chapter on this particular play by Ashwin Singh. But again, interestingly, indenture is presented as a template. It's about a fourth generation family living in the apartheid times, but the play opens with Arindam Rastogi at center stage, recalling his life as an indentured laborer in the cane fields. And the great-great-grandson Sunil, a fourth generation family member, is in conversation with a reporter who is in search of stories of the past. So that's how it opens, and then this is how it ends. Ryoka Light ends dramatically with the Arindam's words. We must shout to the world, I, Arindam, with my wife Pallavi and my friend Biswas, came to this unknown land. We were fooled by selfish, savage people. They tried to make us forget who we are, but we didn't forget. We survived, we grew, we dreamed, and we did something. This is our home. And then, of course, we have our writers here on stage, Joanne Joseph and Shevlin Mutai, and of course, Arvashni Sirapat and Vishika Luka. And the last one I wanted to mention quickly in my shopping list was published in 2024, and this is The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil by Shabnam Khan. She just won a few days ago the Sunday Times Fiction Award. It's an amazing story, but included in this multi-storied piece and novel is the story of indenture. There's the coming together of two persons, one from an indentured background and one from a passenger background, and the story again of forbidden love, but against a very intricate canvas. I think my time is up, Shalima, but I wanted to say that, have I got a few minutes?
Yes, Auntie Patty, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to speak quickly about how indentured texts are read. And I think this is important for us when we're thinking about indentured literature across the diaspora, because it's quite different to the way in which indentured texts are written in South Africa. And of course, it's not static as well. There's a movement of the way in which it has been read over the decades. Firstly, the question of the politics of home. This is a very important theme that emerges, and the way in which the texts are read are against the question of home. And so is India home? Is South Africa home? And given the peculiar experiences under apartheid South Africa, the question of belonging to the land of adoption has become an important trope. And the whole question of the ancestral home is there in the background. So is this writing back to the diaspora, writing back to the homeland, the ancestral homeland? Is it writing back to the adopted home? These are all critical debates that in many ways I have explored and our writers have explored. And I'm giving you some of the texts there. This is why Vijay Mishra, one of our well-known critics of the Indian diaspora and of the literature of the Indian diaspora says that writings from South Africa actually exist outside the Indian diasporic imaginary. And he quotes only one of our writers, Ahmed Dango, as in many ways fitting in to the template, as it were, of Indian diasporic writing. It's a very interesting discussion and worth looking at as for another time, but I just wanted to suggest that there quickly. And of course, Rajendra Chetty initially wrote the book Writing Back, meaning the diaspora writes back, writing back to the homeland. But he's also written about South African Indian writings. It was published in 2002, where he writes about Indian writings writing to South Africa. Palvi Rastogi, one of the US scholars, in her work on South African Indian fiction and the literature of diaspora and indenture, also writes about the way in which this literature is forged in the crucible of the apartheid struggle. I wanted to say that the work and the whole question of the way in which literature, historical information is translated into literature has been really driven and influenced by the work of our literary writers in other parts of the diaspora. And certainly someone like Carl Taraboli has a lot to offer us and has influenced my own writing of poetry on indenture. Then the whole question of history and the Indian Oceans comes into play in the work of someone like Isabel Hofmeyr, and certainly Carl Taraboli, Amitav Ghosh, all of them in many ways looking at the ocean and looking at oceanic literature. So this has had an impact on the way we also read our indenture texts, looking at them again in terms of interdiaspora studies, looking at them against slavery and indenture, because the oceans provide that crisscrossing space for our histories. And I'm quoting a few scholars who have influenced our thinking: Brinda Mehta and Hashini Bana Young. And her book, especially Illegible Will, looks at the labor diasporas of slavery and indenture. And finally, I wanted to say that one of my favorite critiques is that diaspora is by definition about dispersal, and that we should not build fences around it. And certainly in South Africa, looking at our literatures, it goes in different directions. And I wanted to say in conclusion that one of our scholars, Professor Jacobs, and who's also a good friend, has written a book called Diaspora and Identity in South African Fiction. And he looks at the multiple diasporas that comprise South Africa and comprise South African fiction. I myself have written on the Chinese diaspora and a Chinese text in South Africa, but he includes the Indian diaspora, but just to put it out there that there are these crisscrossings of diasporas in South Africa as well, and we have diasporas within diasporas. So I'll conclude with my final paragraph. My Coolie Odyssey, initially emerging cautiously, hesitantly, set me on a rewarding and illuminating learning trajectory. In these journeys, I've become one of Amitav Ghosh's Laskars, adrift on the black waters, at once belonging and not belonging, moving between terracentric forays and transoceanic voyages, being led by the stars under the southern sky, which has writ large the imprints and crisscrossings of slavery and indenture, of negritude and coolitude, floating, haunting capital in the expanse of waters below. And my poetry also reflects this. This is for me, in the end, the compelling diasporic consciousness with its dislocations, forever dispersed, buffeted, scattered in the gales of continents, in the currents of colonies. I'm quoting from Taraboli there. As I refuse to corral the choral imaginary, something of that perpetual voyage in and voyage out, as ancestral flows and challenges of the land of adoption mix and merge, is captured in the poem I composed to mark the 150th anniversary of the arrival of indentured laborers to South Africa. And at the very heart of my many discursive meanderings on indenture is my incessant need to belong to the nation, to return to my native land, and to recreate in the Fanonian sense our single planetary home, so deeply riven, so precarious. With all my love. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Betty. Really, really, a lot of food for thought. You've given us quite an extensive list, I have to say. And I wonder if I should take questions now or if I should take comments now or if we should wait because you've already introduced Joanne and Shevlin who are waiting to speak. So what do you think we should do? Would you like to take questions now?
Let's
I'm
wait
happy,
because
whatever, and I'm
Yeah.
thankful for the extra minutes, but also sorry about the race through the pages.
No, it's
let's
fine.
wait because some of the answers the others may have to respond.
Yeah?
Okay, that's fine. Yes.
Sure. So we'll do that. So to members of the audience, please go ahead, put your comments into the chat. If you have the question directly, we can go ahead and you can enter that into the chat as well so that Auntie Betty could reflect, and later, after the speakers, we will go ahead and allow an opportunity for all the presenters to respond. Auntie Betty? Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But I'd still like to read my poems one day.
I know, I was hoping I would hear some today. You have to do a special for that.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, our second speaker is Shevlin Byron Mutai. She's from England, but South African born. Her debut novel titled Across the Kalapani was longlisted for the 2023 Sunday Times Literary Awards and won the first time published author award that same year. Excellent. Welcome, Shevlin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening. I'm just waiting for my PowerPoint. There we go. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. If we just want to go to present, yeah, that's lovely. Just want to thank everyone for this opportunity to talk about the novel. And while it's been some time, it was published in 2023, it was good to just go back and think about the actual journey itself, of the writing of the novel, and why it was such a special thing for me to have done. I think if you turn to the first slide, if I give you some context here, thank you. It all began probably when I was a girl growing up in South Africa. I'm fourth generation. My ancestors were moved from South India as part of the indenture towards the tail end, 1909, and it was my great grandfather who was moved from India, from Tamil Nadu, and in the backdrop of apartheid South Africa, it was a very interesting one. In terms of people obviously being separated, but within that there was such a massive Indian community, and you felt a part of something. So even far removed, you still felt a connection because everybody around you was Indian, as it was then. But it was also a question around how did you actually fit in. And so growing up, I found that there was just a lack of stories that reflected me. I grew up reading a lot of American writers, British writers, but not really writers and couldn't really identify with characters that looked like me. And given that it was apartheid South Africa, you could imagine that there wasn't much of anyone, there were no works of anybody of color. And if there was, they were usually portrayed as villains. I remember reading Amelia Jane, some Enid Blyton books as a child, and there was the character of the Gollywog and the way that was portrayed. And so it was then I started to realize the power of stories, and perhaps then the power of stories and them needing to be told. And perhaps that's where my passion began, which later led me to train to become an English teacher. But it was the power of stories. And while being an avid reader, I started writing as well. Things that children write, stories in that regard. But all the same, it became a hobby and a pastime. When I grew older, I became an English teacher. I trained in the University of Durban, Westville. And obviously in 94, Nelson Mandela became president. So South Africa had changed, and suddenly we had more access to things, and we're able to access far more literature, and it was suddenly okay to make these inquiries. And I think I was there for about 4 years, and then I immigrated to the UK, and again had to reset in terms of identity. Who am I? A completely different country now, also quite diverse, with more freedoms and opportunities perhaps than I had known previously. So again, I started reading around the topic, just whatever I could get my hands on, just casually, just reading things and just asking more questions. Next slide for me, please. Thank you. This led to the writing of the novel. So I'd consumed, it felt like the research took about 10 years, if I'm really honest. And within that, I visited India. I obviously visited South Africa, went to several archives, and spent a lot of time just reading, just consuming, and the British Library and the British museums. And I also remember going to a sugarcane plantation, just visiting loads of sugarcane plantations to just get a sense, visiting the barracks and the docks to get a sense. And I think it was the inhaling of all this information, as well as visiting places and doing this work. And I didn't quite mean to write a novel that was about the women of indenture, but that's the shape it took. And that, but I always say, it wrote itself. I was merely a channel to do it. I had the pen or the fingers to type onto the computer, but the stories itself were already there. And that's why I dedicated this book to the women of indenture. And if I could just go through that. This novel is dedicated to the Indian women of indenture who took a leap of faith against tremendous odds. Your sacrifices were not in vain, with your wings we soar. And I wrote that at the end of the novel, ironically, I think because it all had come together. And I felt that the power to have visited these places, being educated and being able to access and being able to think and understand and carry out interviews. And it was just a way of me carrying on the legacy. And while those women that I'd encountered, their stories were not always told. There was always an account that may have been questionable. I was very, very conscious that even though their stories were not told and their voices were not heard, I was still a conduit for their stories. And the novel was a way to keep that memory alive. Next slide for me, please. Thank you. This is the end of the novel. Now, this is the last bit, and it's in the acknowledgements section. And I feel like this actually sums up the whole novel. The genre, somebody discussed with me, said, could you consider it to be faction? And I suppose I'd never heard that genre before, but absolutely, fiction based on fact. And why this is relevant is because everything that I've written about actually happened. It may not have been in that sequence. It may not have been to that character that I obviously named, but those events actually happened. And I thought that that was a powerful way to tell the story. As I'm an English teacher, at heart, I also think for it to be a legacy, for it to live on, it needed to change shape from tomes of historical documents or in dusty archives. If I could rebrand it, if I could tell the stories in a way that could connect in a new way, then that's what I had to do. And I wrote this right at the end as well. Lastly, when I did my research, I did not expect to be plagued by the stories and people I encountered in the documents I'd sifted through. I made a connection with real people, people who were often just reduced to an indenture number, and I could not get away from that. I never met them, and they certainly never knew me. The woman specifically got under my skin. I saw you, the woman of indenture. And while I cannot thank you in person, I hope that my telling of your stories goes some way to show my gratitude for your daring and your resolve. And I wrote that at the end because that was the whole point of going through all the research, of melding together the novel. And the novel itself took me 2 years to do the actual writing. And so there was this whole idea of, right, I'm going to do this and I'm going to see what happens. And I think it surpassed my expectations, especially when I had young people reaching out to me to talk about it. And I knew that, you know, I wanted it to make a change, to make a difference, to be something of a legacy. But when I had especially young women reaching out and talking about it, and when I did the book tours and I met a lot of people along the way, I was really happy that I had done it. And I'm glad that it has just a small part in our history. Thank you. I think there's one more slide, and I'm just going to read that. And this is an interesting one about history. And it comes from a woman called Gretel Ehrlich, and she writes a lot about historians and how they immortalize through their work. History is not the truth versus falsehoods, but a mixture of both, the melange of tendencies, reactions, dreams, errors, and power plays. What's important is what we make of it, its moral use. By writing history, we can widen readers' thinking, deepen their sympathies in every direction. Perhaps history should not show us how to control the world, but how to enlarge, deepen, and discipline ourselves. And I just, you know, the point I was making is through writing this book, through writing the novel, it was to immortalize those characters, but also to make sure that there was something in the direction of the future as well. Thank you.
Shafan, this is, you know, one of the things that touched me that you said was when you reflected on the importance of the woman and their struggle, and that we soar through them. It resonates with me. And I think for all of the ancestral women, we salute them as well. I want to thank you for pointing that out. Very powerful. Thank you very much for that contribution. I'm seeing some comments in the chat, and please go ahead and read that. And of course, we will come back to the questions after. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker is Joanne Joseph of South Africa. She's a prominent radio and television host for major broadcasters, including Prime Media House. She is also a best-selling author with the book Children of Sugarcane being her first work of fiction. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you so much for having me, Shalima, and it's really lovely to be with all of you this evening. Dr. Kumar, I appreciate the platform. Thank you so much. So this is a lovely opportunity to offer some insights into my novel, Children of Sugarcane. And thanks very much, Naveen, for controlling the slides. And when I started writing it in 2011, I was all too aware that the narrative of indenture was a hidden history in our country. And unlike particular territories where stories of indenture are embedded in oral and or written history, South Africa is a little different. South Africans of Indian descent account for roughly 2.5% of our country's population, which makes our community a very, very small community indeed. And the continuum of slavery into colonization, into apartheid, has meant that narratives of the global north have really dominated our discourse and our education for hundreds of years. So even post-democracy, you might be interested to hear, the Black majority is still having to work hard to establish and entrench a canon of Black African literature in our country, leaving quite large gaps in our literary and historical knowledge of our past as a nation. Now, Indian South Africans only officially became recognized as part of South Africa's population in 1961, believe it or not. Prior to this, we were largely stereotyped as foreign, despite being the second large group of us having begun our lives here from 1860 onwards. So unsurprisingly, our literature too was considered foreign, and that's something that Auntie Betty, Dr. Betty Govenden, highlights in her brilliant book, Sister Outsiders, which you must have a
John,
read.
can I interrupt you for just 1 second, please?
Yes,
Are
sure.
you wearing a mic?
No, I'm not.
You're not. Okay.
No.
Right. There's a bit of some static or something there, but go ahead, please. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's all.
All right. Yes, that book that I was recommending by Dr. Betty Govenden, Sister Outsiders, will give you a very good idea of how the literature of South Africa in a way has been, or Indian South Africa has been excluded from the canon in many ways. So I'm going to ask for a change of slide here, please, Naveen. Whether due to the shame around the human rights atrocities and the degradation which accompanied indenture in the colony of Natal, or whether they were simply hoping to spare their descendants what we now know as the burden of history, most Girmithias chose not to pass on the horrific stories of indenture to their children. And as Shevlin said, consequently, it hasn't only been the many other diverse South African communities who've missed out on these stories and are devoid of the knowledge of indentured literature. This applies equally to Indians of South African extract. We don't know our stories very well either. And I decided that I didn't want another generation of my family to go without some semblance of what indenture entails. So I began the long archival search for my great-grandmother, armed only with the knowledge of her first name, which was Adalakshmi. Next slide, please, Naveen. Now, the archive revealed the date that Adalakshmi had arrived in 1884 on the Laurel Madras, and it confirmed that she'd come with 3 younger siblings, all of whom were put to work on the Natal government railways with her, despite the fact that 2 of them at least were underage. I also learned she'd been married twice. She converted to Christianity. She ran a Methodist mission from her home for 30 years, post-indenture. But I discovered this information was just not enough to write a non-fiction narrative about her life, unfortunately. And so, Children of Sugarcane was born. Next slide, please. I spent 9 years mining the narratives of the Girmithias of our country, and those were expertly compiled by our historians in the country, particularly the stories of the women and children, beautifully ventilated in some of the academic texts. And it seemed to me it was really important to tell their story because they were caught in the stickiest part of indenture's web. And I was determined that the novel was going to be a distinctly feminist work, describing the desperate situations in India which drove them to indenture, the violent intersectional nature of the discrimination Indian women faced, how they were exploited economically, physically, sexually, emotionally, but also how they found some measure of agency in relationships and in their working spaces, how they raised families, how they protected and educated their children, and developed a sense of community, which would come to characterize the community which they gave rise to, and that eventually succeeded them hundreds of years later. My protagonist, Shanti, is a rebellious and ambitious 14-year-old who takes up the yoke of indenture to escape an arranged marriage. And the small amount of education that she's able to access due to the generosity of another woman in her village allows Shanti to dream beyond the limits of indenture. And though she's deeply oppressed by the subjugation that follows and that's foisted upon her as soon as she lands on the plantation, in fact, even before then, well before then, she uses every tool in her power to resist those efforts at subjugation. She does her best to manipulate power in as many ways as possible, and she eventually prevents the system from crushing her altogether. Next slide, please. It was important to me that the indenture story, which had been prevented from being widely accessible to this prior to gatekeeping in publishing in South Africa, had to go mainstream. It had to reach every South African community as well as readers from abroad, if that was possible. And my publisher, Jonathan Ball, respected the story. They certainly made an effort to use their publicity machinery and my platform as a journalist to promote the novel, which thankfully became a bestseller locally. And I'm really glad that in South Africa, where socially segregation still remains a reality, that people of all backgrounds have opened up their hearts to the story, and they now have a deeper understanding of the history of the Indian South African community in our country and greater empathy for our historical struggles. And also, on a personal note, that I've been able to give my daughter the gift of memory against forgetting, that I hope she will be able to treasure for the rest of her life, given that I only came to the story in my 40s, and she was able to possess that story, part of our history, by the age of 15. Next slide, please, Naveen. Now, I think preserving memory is important to our country. One of our renowned authors, Brayton Breitenbach, suggests that just as you cannot survive without dreams, you cannot move on without the memory of where you came from, even if the journey is fictitious. And we've been having an intense discussion in our academic spaces about decolonization. But when I was writing this book, it occurred to me, many of us don't even have a clear concept of what colonization was about how it broke down our political, social, cultural, and religious systems that were existing. It entrenched all kinds of violence, and that violence, including the kind of violence like gender-based violence, has permeated our modern society. It continues to plague us desperately in South Africa today. So I sought to answer the simple question of what a day in the life of a colonized ancestor might have looked like: the poverty, the hunger, the fear, the yearning for one's lost home and family, the effort to evade disease, to evade the label of another suicide case, which marked the period of indenture here. And there are aspects of my novel which I concede are distinctly violent, but I felt disinclined to water them down. I thought, if this is the first novel that readers are going to be able to access on indenture in colonial Natal, I'm not going to spare the reader as to the reality of what happened. As my daughter said to me a few days ago, the readers who are horrified by reading about this violence must understand that your great-grandmother and others lived through it. And so sometimes I ask this question of readers who don't want to tackle the subject matter: if not now, when will you decide it's not okay to turn your face from it? Surely, in the aftermath of hundreds of years, we can commit to the responsibility to bear witness. Academic Siobhan Nelson reminds us of the occasion when a friend invited her to watch the film Hotel Rwanda about the Rwandan genocide, and how she simply wasn't in the mood for it after a hard day's work. But her friend insists in that moment. She says to her, "You must see it, sooner or later. It's the least we can do." And Nelson immediately understands what her friend means by saying that. She is being offered the opportunity to take up the responsibility to bear witness. And she says to know what happened, to feel the pain and helplessness and the guilt of the world community that failed them. And Nelson eventually concedes it is quite simply necessary that we do not forget what happened. Thank you, Naveen. That's the end of my slides. Readers descended from the Girmithias seem to report a similar reaction to Shevlin, Arvashni's, and my book. They tell us that they feel a visceral connection to the characters, their suffering, their small triumphs. Somehow, this genre of historical fiction, which allows us not just to document the what, but the who and the how and the why, it proves immersive enough to suspend the reader's disbelief and momentarily reaches deep into the core of the reader's humanity, allowing a moment of empathy, or at the very least, sympathy for the plight of the character and the hardship they are enduring. Alison Landsberg seizes on this in her theory of prosthetic memory, which I thought was interesting. She applies it more specifically to the power of film in inculcating empathy, but I believe this applies equally to the power of effectively written historical fiction. Landsberg believes that art can have exactly the same effect on consumers who are brought into immediate and intimate contact with a set of experiences that fall well outside of their own lived experience, and as a result, are forced to look at it through someone else's eyes and asked to remember those situations and events as both meaningful and potentially formative. She also asserts that this process can force viewers to engage both intellectually and emotionally with another who is radically different from him or herself. And she suggests this level of empathy brought about through art may be so powerful as to condition people to see and think in ways that could foster more radical forms of democracy aimed at advancing egalitarian social goals. And I think that's something that we particularly need to start working towards in the world in which we're currently living, if we look at the milieu in which we operate. If this is possible in South Africa in particular, this would be a really special thing to us, because although we haven't reached across the divide effectively enough somehow, I think historical fiction literature can actually play a part in doing the heavy lifting for us. And for a moment, when the reader casts their eye on the text and they allow themselves to be absorbed into the historical milieu, something powerful could happen in the present. We could imagine the hope of being one nation, embracing one another's historical and intergenerational vulnerabilities, pain, trauma, and strengths through literature, connecting us in ways that interlock us as one South African and African family. And although the narratives of indenture have played out somewhat uniquely in each former colony where indenture was entrenched, perhaps that sense of connection extends too to each of us as children of the Girmethias, as we collectively reimagine the past in tribute to our courageous ancestors. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joanne. Very,
Thank you.
very interesting take on the whole indenture experience. And there are some comments and questions in the chat. Please go ahead, refer to that. And again, we will take questions. Sorry, we'll take a response from you at the end of all presentations. Yeah, thanks so much. So Joanne mentioned Arvashni, and I want to bring Arvashni now. This is Arvashni Siripat of the US with roots in South Africa. She has a deep desire to tell the stories of indenture. Her debut novel, titled The Story I Told Myself, portrays the struggles of single Indian women as migrant laborers. She's unavailable to present in person, but she's taken the time to prepare a video, and Navin will share that with you now.
Now we're not getting volume.
Navin, we're still not getting audio. Okay, so we're back to Joanne. Joanne, I guess you could present again. Okay,
Good
let's
afternoon,
see.
everyone. My name is Arvashni Sirpat, and I'm the author of The
Very
Story,
low.
a historical fictional novel that is set in South Africa in the late 1800s, and that is focused on the female indentureship experience during that time.
Dr. Mahabir, are you hearing this?
Residing in New Jersey.
Very low. Maybe we can turn on the closed caption, probably.
And my
Yeah,
I don't know if that
let's
would
host.
help.
in the late
Go
1800s,
ahead.
landed on the shores of Durban and really set the experience for me and my entire family. I'm extremely proud of the choices they made, because the choices they made allowed me to stand here today.
Navin, can the volume increase?
Before I go any further, I want to thank the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and the Amina Ghafoor Institute for having me.
That's
here
maximum
today.
volume
It is
there.
indeed both a pleasure and a deeply humbling
Okay.
experience.
Well, I'm not seeing the closed caption here on my panel. Where is that?
Fiction
Yeah, we can't get
and the
closed
indentured
caption. She just because she
experience.
pre-recorded this
Now, I'm
with her phone,
Oh,
so
right.
Okay, but each participant can turn on closed captioning
Yeah.
on theirs. It's unfortunate,
Yeah.
though, for the YouTube audience and for the recording, we won't be able to hear her.
and a towering figure.
No, the YouTube
usually the
has
YouTube is
closed
be okay.
caption.
It's be fine.
YouTube is okay?
Yeah,
Dr.
usually it
Govindan,
is.
we are all extremely
Okay, so
grateful.
can we ask each participant, please turn on closed captioning on your particular Zoom?
And the scholarship around the Indian indentured experience is characterized by predominantly the male perspective. Historical records show us that history of any experience, indenture or other, generally captures the female experience as an exception. And that is
Is this frustrating anyone, or are we okay?
whose
Okay,
death-
Pat, you're hearing her very well. Okay.
Basically, it negates the integral contribution that women make to the overall society. Yet instinctively we know that the female experience cannot be an exception. It has to be the foundation and a part of the foundational build of any society. This experience, this exception, clearly demonstrates that telling stories might give us a more holistic view of the micro experience of indentured women in South Africa, as an example, and in many other areas, versus the singular macroeconomic focus that we have, that our esteemed male scholars may give us because of a focus on just historical record. It is through the telling of these stories that are passed down as family folklore that we really get to experience and understand the pain, the resilience, the grit that tells a more complete and a more comprehensive story of the overall indenture experience, and specifically the overall female experience. My novel, The Story I Told Myself, is set in 1887 in a fictional town of Ishapur in India, where a young, desperate Shivali takes the road of indenture with her two small children, Hari and Uma, to escape the poverty and the pain that engulfs her life in Ishapur. The novel takes a long view on the experience and the resultant outcomes of her and her children. But more importantly, it helps us understand what her journey was like. What are some of the highs and lows that she experienced? What are some of the microaggressions that she experienced on a consistent basis? But how she also demonstrated resilience. How she ensured that her children had a better life. And importantly, how she set the foundations for who we are today. Let's talk about the story I told myself in 3 parts. First, I want to focus a little bit around the family stories, the oral traditions. These are stories that are passed down, retold. They are legends, and these stories both give power to the people who tell them, but also take away power, because they hold us hostage sometimes when we don't tell the stories in their full context. Secondly, apart from telling the oral stories, I want to put the oral stories into their historical context, right? While these are fictional stories, and they may be an elaboration of the oral traditions that we hear, or the oral stories that we hear, what they also do is set us in the reality of what was happening at that time. And the third aspect that I'd like us to focus on is, what does this past mean for our collective and individual futures as we move forward? Now, when I think about the historical context, and I think about what life was like at that time, let's go a little bit deeper into the oral traditions first. Let me tell you a little story. My great-great-grandmother came to South Africa with her 2 children. A woman with a son, whose son, my great-grandfather, became a teacher in his community, whose daughter built a legacy that helped to create a strong foundation for a family that is extremely resilient and powerful today in the lives that they lead. Joanne and Shevlin, both on this panel, speak about drawing from their own experiences as well. Now, these stories are not necessarily fiction. They are not stories that are made up stories. They are stories that hold power of truth. And they are stories that get passed down through generations because there's no one to actually capture their stories in a historical context. These stories have 2 options. They either hold us hostage as stories we don't want to repeat because they are painful, or they give us power because they help us understand our historical context, and they help us understand the women that built and created these foundations for us, that set us up to be the strong community that we are today in South Africa. By elevating these stories, we understand their contributions. And by collectively owning their stories, we build on their power. Now, when we set these stories in historical context, this is where we truly bring things to life. When we talk about the female experience being defined by exception, and as I mentioned, driven by violence, generally rape, murder, domestic abuse, right? We're sitting in today in December, which is a month where gender-based violence and domestic abuse is strongly discussed in a South African society. There's an interesting take on history that men tell truth and women tell stories. And stories are considered fiction, and fiction is considered lies. Let's put some of these stories in historical context. I want to tell you a story about Voti Veerama Somaya, who in 1893 went to the Indian Protectorate and said that the plantation owner where she lived was making advances to her, sexual advances with her, and she wanted to be transferred to another plantation because she did not want to be assaulted. The plantation owner, of course, said she lied, and the Indian Protectorate at that time sided with the plantation owner. They gave her, Voti Veerama Somaya, 7 months in prison because no one believed that she could be telling the truth. This is just an example that clearly demonstrates how deeply ingrained gender-based violence was in the indentured experience. Not only were women subjected to this kind of violence, they were also subjected to pay disparities, which of course we live with today. They were subjected to extremely harsh working conditions. And most importantly, they were erased from the historical record because they were invisible and their stories were lost to history. Now, when we think about the oral traditions set in the historical context, and you understand how we erased our women by making them invisible, you realize how important it is to continue to tell their stories even through historical fiction. In fact, historical fiction may be one of the best ways to elevate the stories of these women. But what does this mean for the future? The past helps us. Understanding these stories helps us to really put context around what happened, what we are willing to accept today, and are we willing to erase the stories of these collective women. I myself, as I mentioned, am of Indian origin, South African born, and now I reside in the US. I'm not unique. There are many like me that have an origin that is different to their land of birth, that is different to the land where they live. It sets a context for me for what does belonging mean, and very importantly, it forces me to think deeply, and I would really invite all of us to think deeply about whose stories are we going to tell, when are we going to tell those stories, and in which context we will do them. What is really important for me is that oral traditions, historical context, not only helps us understand where we came from and our past, but sets very much a future or a blueprint for how we can understand the future that we create for ourselves. Stories like Shivali's are not unique. And Shivali, from the story I told myself, is reflective of a collective experience, and yet is uniquely told because men tell truth and women tell stories. Thank you very much to the Indo-Caribbean Culture Center for having me today, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with you my thoughts on why historical fiction is so important for the indentured experience. Thank you.
That's a very interesting point that you raised there. One that I don't think we pay attention to. That what women say Women, when they present their experiences, turns out to be stories in this patriarchal society that we still live in. Men's words are still taken for truth. Very, very significant. So, Tarbashni, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, she's not here to take your questions, unfortunately, but certainly we would appreciate your comments based on her presentation. You can go ahead and put it in the chat, and our speakers who are here, some of whom she knows well, will be able to respond. Thank you. Let's move to our fifth speaker now, and this is Vishika Luca of France, a South African-born Indian author. She draws inspiration from her multicultural experiences. Her latest book was sparked by her children's curiosity about their roots. So Navin, let's have her presentation, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Vishika, and I'm a South African Indian living in Paris with my family. Today, I want to share my story behind my children's book entitled Sugar. A story that carries centuries of history, but is told through tenderness, metaphor, and softness. This book began, as many important stories do, when my children asked me a simple question about where I come from. And I realized that answering that truthfully meant going far beyond geography. It meant speaking about migration, labor, injustice, survival, and voice, but in a way that children could hold on emotionally. Sugar is a story about the Indian South African community, from indenture through apartheid into liberation, and finally into having a voice of your own. It's structured kind of like a timeline. I wrote it for my children, yes, but also for adults who teach them, raise them, and shape them to understand history. The story begins in the mid-1800s, where thousands of Indians were brought to South Africa as indentured laborers. Many were poor, many were promised opportunity, many did not fully grasp or understand what this journey entailed. They came across the ocean by ship, they arrived in a land that was not their home, and they were sent straight into the sugarcane fields. The work was brutal and the days were long. Families were broken apart by distance, language, and law. These people who once only knew maybe village life, who had family networks in India, suddenly found themselves reduced to just labor numbers on plantations. In Sugar, I don't describe violence directly. I describe exhaustion. I describe longing. I describe quiet suffering. I'll actually show you a page from the book that depicts a man holding a bundle of sugarcane in the heat. So yes, this is where the South African story begins, in survival. And what I wanted to do with the book, in fact, was I wanted something extraordinary to happen in this journey. I wanted to show this to the people, hope to the children. People stayed, they formed families, they planted roots in foreign soil, and from indentured workers, a community began to form. Temples and mosques, places of worship were built, schools were created, food traditions evolved, and languages blended. Music shifted, and faith traveled across oceans and adapted to new skies. Indian South Africans were no longer simply Indian. They were becoming something new, shaped by Africa, yet still holding on to the memory of India. This blending of identity is a quiet but very central theme in Sugar, because children of migration always grow up between two worlds. They inherit both loss and possibility at the same time. I also depict in the book apartheid and colonization, actually. This is a depiction of colonization. And this is a depiction of apartheid. So we have people at the bottom looking through this massive gaping hole. So when apartheid came, I explained that it was a system that sorted, limited, and controlled human lives by race. Indian South Africans were classified into separate racial category. They were restricted in where they could live, where they could study, who they could love. And apartheid did not affect all communities in the same way, but it affected all non-white communities profoundly. For Indian South Africans, it meant living in a constant in-between, not white enough for privilege, not always centered in the broader liberation narrative either. In sugar, apartheid is not loud, it is presented as barriers, boundaries, invisible fences, the quiet knowledge that your world is smaller than it should be. This is an important part for children to understand. Injustice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's slow, it's constant, and it's suffocating. And then finally, I also depict liberation. Nelson Mandela with the people lining up to vote. So the end of apartheid did not instantly heal everything, but it changed what was possible. Suddenly the future began to stretch much wider for everyone. Suddenly voices that were suppressed and been quiet for such a long time began to rise. For many Indian South African families, this meant something deeply emotional. The first generation to grow up with true access to opportunity. Education without racial ceilings, careers without racial permission. I belong to that bridge generation, raised in the shadow of apartheid, but shaped by its ending. And sugar is deeply infused with that transition, the movement from silence to speech, from survival to expression. And for a long time, Indian South Africans, the stories existed quietly, I would say, in kitchens, in prayer rooms, in community halls, rarely in schools, rarely in mainstream literature. To have a voice is just not about speaking, it's about being seen, validated, and remembered. And this is where educators are so vital, our teachers, because children don't only learn identity at home, they learn it in the classrooms. They learn whose stories matter by which stories are included. When a child sees their heritage reflected in books, I believe something inside of them softens, something stands a bit taller. What do I hope children take from sugar? I hope that they learn that communities are built from courage, not comfort. I hope that they feel pride and empathy without pity. And most of all, I hope that they learn their stories, whatever they are, matter. Because sugar is not only about Indians in South Africa. It's about migration everywhere. It's about survival everywhere. It is about children everywhere who grew up carrying histories they did not choose, but will one day shape their own voice. Sugar carries that entire arc, from labor to silence to voice. And this book is not a history textbook. It's a love letter of sorts, and a homage to resilience. And most of all, I think it was a homage to my kids. This book exists because they wanted to know me. And I think one of the hardest parts in creating Sugar wasn't writing it, it was deciding what to leave out. Because how do you condense over 100 years of pain, survival, and transformation into something that a child can hold? I wrote draft after draft after draft. I added, I cut, I softened. Then I worried I softened too much. Then I worried I made it too heavy again. And throughout all of this, I was incredibly lucky to have Joanne and my kids actually as my sounding board. And Joanne's on the call today, so I'm very grateful, eternally grateful to her. Joanne and my children, they listen to every version, the long versions, the tangle versions, the emotional versions, where I wanted to say everything. And I checked whether they understood it, and I checked with Joanne whether it was important to include in the book as well. And they kept asking good questions. There were countless back and forths, so many edits, and so many moments where I didn't know what to keep and what to let go of. Condensing such a long and painful history was not easy. It was not an easy task, and there were moments where I felt like I was betraying parts of the story by leaving things out. But then I understood that telling the truth does not always mean telling everything. Sometimes it just means telling enough with care The same back and forth, the process happened with the illustrations, because I didn't want the images that were literal. I wanted them to feel dreamlike, emotional, symbolic. And I wanted the children to feel the history, not just study it. And I'm very aware of how lucky I am to be living in Paris, where art is everywhere. And that also gave me permission to be very bold with the drawings, with the illustrations. I thought about Picasso, how he likes to break form, about Gaudi, how he bends and dances with the images, Chagall, how he floats between reality and dream. And I kept asking myself questions as well. How do you show labor without showing violence? How do you show pain without it being scary? How do you show migration without showing loss as a final image? So the images became very layered. Sugarcane represented rhythm for me. The ocean became a movement. Homes became memory, and faces more emotion than detail. There was a constant dialogue between the words and the art. Sometimes the illustrations changed the meaning of the text. Sometimes the text had to step back and let the image speak. And again, Joanne and my kids were there advising me along the way, take this out, put this in, chop and change. I print everything to the walls to have a big overview, like a mind, like a mood board of what I wanted to create. And the book became a conversation long before it actually became this finished product. What matters to me deeply is that sugar doesn't end in pain. It ends in a voice, it ends in visibility, and it ends in hope for kids. And I think that's very, very important. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm very, very grateful. And I hope you all go out and grab a copy of Sugar. It is a beautiful book illustrated with a lot of love. Thank you.
So wonderful. Another fabulous book. We did a program, was it 2 weeks ago, Dr. Mahabir?
Yeah.
On children's stories. So this is another one to add to that collection, and it's such important work so that children do indeed understand their heritage and feel a sense of belongingness. Very, very important work. So Joanne, thank you as well for assisting in the way that she's described that you have. Thank you for that. So to Vishika, excellent work, and hopefully we will get some information to our audience as to how they can access the book if they need to purchase, because this is a good time to give gifts such as those. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our sixth and final speaker today is Arti Gosain from right here in Trinidad. She began writing short stories in primary school and is now the author of 5 children's books for readers aged 7 to 12. A Place to Call Home is her first foray into historical fiction. And we also have a pre-recorded presentation from her. Navin, can we get that, please?
Namaste. I'd like to thank Dr. Mahabir and the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center for giving me this opportunity to speak to you about my new book, A Place to Call Home. A Place to Call Home is a work of historical fiction set during the period of indentureship in Trinidad. It was inspired by the Husay riots that took place in 1884 in Monrepo, San Fernando. But exactly what do we mean when we talk about historical fiction? Historical fiction is a genre in which the story's plot, characters, and sometimes even specific events are imagined, but the narrative unfolds within a real historical period and is shaped by the actual cultures, experiences, and events of that time. The novel follows the life of Suku, beginning in his small village in India and continuing to the Philippine sugar estate in South Trinidad. There, he rises from laborer to one of the estate's headmen. Through Suku and the supporting cast of characters, the story explores the daily lives of the indentured laborers, both in their fields and in their homes. In 2004, Dr. Rabindranath Maharaj, more familiarly known as Raviji, began a walk from Chaguanas to Monrepo to raise awareness of these riots, also known as the Muharram Massacre. Until then, this vital chapter of our history was little known among the general public. His efforts inspired me to begin my own research into the massacre and the circumstances that led to it. One of my major sources of information was the book entitled The Years of Revolt, 1881 to 1884, by Father Anthony de Vitale, a well-known historian in Trinidad. While I was able to gather information about the revolt and the tragic events that followed, I found very little written about the daily lives of the indentured immigrants themselves. And this is where the fiction came in. Their routines, their relationships, their struggles and joys, those stories had to be imagined and crafted and brought to life. But why are historical fiction novels so important? Historical fiction novels are important because they do something uniquely powerful. They bring history to life. They make history relatable and human. Historical fiction takes events that may feel distant, abstract, or academic and turns them into a human experience. The lives, emotions, struggles, and choices that we can understand. Readers connect to history on a deeper emotional level than when they follow characters who have lived through these events. They give a voice to people who have never been recorded. Many groups, enslaved people, indentured laborers, women, the poor, left behind very little written documentation. Historical fiction allows us as writers to imagine and honor those lives, filling the silences left in the historical records. This is especially important in Caribbean history, where marginalized voices are rarely preserved. They spark interest in real history. A compelling story often inspires readers to explore the real events behind the fiction. Historical fiction becomes a gateway to further learning, encouraging curiosity about cultures, conflicts, and eras that readers may have never studied before. They preserve cultural memory. Historical fiction helps keep memories alive. Traditions, struggles, celebrations, injustices that may have otherwise fade over time. In the context of indentureship, colonialism, or diaspora history, these novels contribute to cultural identity and collective memory. They build empathy. By stepping into another time and another person's shoes, readers develop a better understanding of people who have lived in very different circumstances, like the indentured laborers. This builds empathy and broadens perspectives about global and historical human experiences. They allow us to explore what might have been. While grounded in real history, the fictional element allows authors to imagine the hidden conversations, private struggles, the daily lives behind major events. This helps create a fuller, more textured picture of the past. They connect the past to present-day issues. Historical fiction often reflects themes that are still relevant: migration, injustice, resistance, survival, identity, love, and family. Readers can draw parallels to modern society, making the genre not just about the past, but about understanding the present. Historical fiction is important because it transforms history from dates and facts to living, breathing human stories. It preserves cultural memory, gives voices to people who left few records behind, builds empathy, and it encourages readers to explore and understand the real history that shaped who we are today. During my research, I found two historical fiction novels: The Jumbie Bird by Ismet Khan which was published in 1961. It tells the story of an Indo-Trinidadian family over generations, beginning with a migrant from India. The novel reflects the transformation of indentured immigrant roots into Indo-Trinidadian identity. And another one called Charlo Trinidad by Jang B. Bajirati, described as a historical novel dealing with indentureship. It tracks a character's journey from India to Trinidad and details plantation life and indenture experience. Now, these books are very important to us and should be in every library and possibly in every home, because it gives us a sense of place and identity and helps us to learn where our forefathers came from and what struggles they had to endure. I'd now like to read 2 short excerpts from my book, A Place to Call Home. The dust was unforgiving, getting into his eyes, hair, and worst of all, his mouth. He could feel a thin layer of it coating his skin as he walked along the road to his spot on the corner. The bottom of his dingy cotton dhoti, almost see-through after countless washes, was covered with a layer of dust from the road. Before the monsoons came to Saharasa, the dust coated everything and everyone. Whatever little he had to eat for the day was covered in dust. He could feel the grit between his teeth as he chewed and then felt it going down his throat as he swallowed. Spreading his jute bag on the dusty ground, Suku sat cross-legged and tried to make himself as comfortable as possible. This would be his position for most of the day. Around him, more and more beggars took up their positions. They crowded the roadsides, forcing the pedestrians onto the road. Some of them called out to those same passers-by, begging for paisa, others for something to eat. Others still were so emaciated and weak from hunger, all they could manage was to hold out their hand and hope something fell into their palms. This was Suku's occupation for most of his 26 years. This longevity gave him the prime location on the corner. From there, he could watch people coming from every direction. He had seen older beggars pass away from various ailments and even starvation. Each time, as soon as that poor, unfortunate spot opened up, the other beggars fought to claim it. The more recently you turned to begging, the further down the road you sat. Even among beggars, there was a hierarchy. Life for the Dalits, or untouchables as they were known, was a tough one. They were seen by their fellow Indians as the lowest in the hierarchy of caste and were therefore resigned to the most menial jobs, those that no one else wanted to do or felt that they were too good for. They did any job that was seen as unclean for the higher caste. They were the road sweepers, garbage collectors, and disposers of dead animals. And even then, they were still sometimes seen as not good enough, even for these tasks. Many of them had no choice but to become beggars. Suku did not call out to everyone who passed. Instead, he made careful selection. He watched as each person came closer and waited until he could make eye contact with them. Then he knew he had them. With sad eyes, he would beg him for something to eat while rubbing his torso with his left hand. Once a person had met his gaze, he had him hooked. He felt they had to come over, but they would avert their eyes as they dropped a few coins into his dirty palm. Suku pocketed the few coins, knowing that even the smallest amount would help him. He would do this from sunrise to sunset, not wanting to miss out on a single person who might look at him in the eye, even if it meant the hunger pangs in his stomach would become overwhelming. Sometimes someone would mercifully toss him their half-eaten chapati, for it was carelessly thrown, which it was so often was, and didn't land on his hand or lap. A vicious struggle would ensue with the other beggars. Hunger was their constant companion. The sun was their other companion, beating mercilessly upon them for most of the day. Only the early monsoons offered some relief, but the torrential rain treated them just as badly. Sitting for years in the scorching sun had toughened his skin, like the hide of the cattle that wandered freely in the roadway, but the heavy raindrops still felt like needles. Luckily, his shack was close to the river so that he could bathe often. Unfortunately, as a Dalit, these baths had to be taken quickly and under the cover of darkness. To some, just by the lower caste, bathing in the river causes it to become contaminated. Many of the other beggars just went home and straight to bed, only to rise and return to the streets the next day. As darkness fell, Suku rose from his mat as fast as his cramped legs would allow. Sometimes the pain was so excruciating that it took several tries before he could stand upright and take a few steps. He picked up his mat and pocketed whatever he got home for the day. He kept his head lowered as he walked home, this time avoiding eye contact in any way he could. There were thieves everywhere, and they were more than willing to steal from a beggar. The other excerpt I will read is from chapter 22. Ganesh, Drupadi called out to her husband the Sunday after the meeting with the magistrates. I need to get some flour. Go by the shop and buy a bag for me. Droops, but we just bought flour last week. Well, it's finished. I make roti every day. It can't last forever. I know, but the price in the shop has gone up. Everything costing more now. Baal says it costs more for him to buy his goods, so we have to pay more. So what do you expect me to do? It's not like I spend the money on myself. I haven't bought a new sari in years. I know, Droops, I know, Ganesh replied, defeated. I don't know why you all just can't work in the fields and obey the rules instead of making trouble with the white man. Ganesh spun around to face his wife. What are you talking about? Drupadi flung the cloth that she was using to hold the hot pot onto the table. Who say, that's all you're thinking about. Do you think that the laborers will ever get more money or better working conditions after you all defy the white man? I thought you supported us. I did, but now it's gone too far. You could be hurt and even killed. Tears trickled down her cheeks as her true fears came out. Ganesh embraced his wife. He understood her fears. He led her to the front steps where they sat side by side. Drup, it's not just about defying the white man. These people have taken so much from us. They treat us like animals in the field. More and more tasks to do. They whip us mercilessly when it's not done. They take away our dignity. I can't even provide properly for my family. Look at the squalor we live in. We hardly have any room in here to move. The roof falling apart. The children.
Navin, did you end the video?
I think that's the end.
Yeah, that's the end of the video. Yeah.
Ended abruptly, yes.
Oh, okay. So she was talking there about I don't think he was the protagonist, but certainly one of the characters' experience of Hussein and why his justification for joining that Hussein march. And Navin, I found it interesting that you were one of the people who actually went on that march with Raviji. Can you just share with us what you gained out of it?
If it's one spot. So that so I think it in some way connected me with our ancestors. It it was just a way for me to feel or experience just a tiny bit of the trials and tribulations that they experience. By no means it was in any way the amount uh of pain and anguish that they would have experienced, but I felt that it connected me in some small way. So that's why I did. I did it more than once actually. So and it's not easy. And it's not easy. So when you finish you're literally covered in soot and burnt rubber. You are three different colors when you're finished. So it's very difficult.
And this is just the walk. And what happens when you all get to Monrepo?
So usually when we get to Monrepo, there's a small program where they would talk about some of the history and that sort of thing. So that's really all it is. Yes. So there's some history of why we do this walk and that sort of thing.
Do you recommend it?
Definitely, but he hasn't done it in a while because I don't think he'll ever do it again. And it's as you asked that question, I was thinking that I think I need to talk to some of our colleagues and try and get that back as a walk for people to be able to do again because he is no
Yeah.
longer fit enough to do it.
Mhm.
So it hasn't been done in some years. So I'll need to talk to some of our colleagues and see if we can plan that program and get that walk back up. I'll let everyone know once we get.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of the speakers, and I just want to ask you if you have a short question or comment, please raise your electronic hand. It's in the reactions button at the base of your computer screen. This is if you want to pose a question directly to any of the speakers today. Dr. Mahabir.
Yes, thank you. Indentureship was by and large a great leveler, right? Really erasing most different of these social distinctions, particularly with caste, because from the time you were recruited, it was unimportant, really, if you were of any kind of caste, Brahmin, Chatri, and so on. They wanted laborers. You could work hard. That was the main criteria. And when you got to the depot, everybody was crammed together in the depot in Calcutta or in Madras. When you came to the ship, you had to eat together, you had to sit together, you had to sleep together, you had to converse together. So these caste barriers started to break down. When you reached the estates and you went to the barracks, right? No distinctions of caste. They didn't put high caste in one side or one section of the barracks and low caste in the other. I have an issue with the last presentation in which the term Dalits is used. That's a modern term. It never existed in the historical literature or anywhere else. If you have conversations with the elderly people. So I think there's much exaggeration about discrimination against Dalits and Chamars, as we know the term, from that narrative. It's an exaggeration. It's true. I don't think it reflects the historical record or the oral historical narrative. So we have to be careful when we do historical fiction that we are sometimes our own history. That's a comment. The question I have with respect to the people from South Africa, the writers from South Africa, there's abundance of literature. I'm really impressed. Historical fiction. And in the Caribbean, we have coined the term out there in the domain Indo-Caribbean literature. Has there been such a terminology in Africa? Indo-South African literature. And more importantly, are there courses in the curriculum, whether it's in the high school or the university? Thank you.
I think I want to ask Dr. Betty to address that question. I heard a number of genres raised that I had never heard before. And then we had this one, faction. Dr. Betty, can you please respond? I think it was Shevlin who spoke about faction, which I'd never heard before.
Where's
Dr. Betty, can you unmute, please? Is she here?
I don't think so. I'm not seeing her. No, I'm not seeing her.
Okay, I'll give her a call after.
Yeah.
Shevlin?
I'm happy to attempt to answer that, Shalima, if that helps.
Thanks.
Okay, so in terms of, bear in mind, I left South Africa 22 years ago. So in terms of curriculum, but I'm a head teacher. I'm a head teacher in the UK, and what I can say is I've seen a huge move here in the UK to include diversity. You know, to include the Windrush. You know, all of the things that impact societies here, and to tell the stories. I understand from colleagues who still work in South Africa that is the direction of travel. There's more and more of that happening with the curriculum. But if I'm really honest, not enough. And I think there's still some more grassroots issues around literacy and accessibility to education. So perhaps, do you know, when we think about how we educate a nation, how we educate children, the building blocks is get them into school, get them reading and writing, keep them safe, get them all in there, you know. And I'm not sure we've overcome that hurdle, first. The curriculum is forming, is building, it's becoming more diverse. There's certainly more text being introduced, as far as I understand. But in itself, this is a piece to a large piece of work. And that is still to be done. In response, Shalima, to that genre faction, I think, there is some truth in it. There is the melding of facts into fiction to tell a story. And for me, thinking about what young people read now, how they read, how we get their interest, it's like 10, 15 years ago, if you thought about social media and Instagram and things like that, we would have been like, we don't, that's not going to work, or we would have been not sure because it was around the corner. We couldn't quite see it. But now we understand it, and we understand the power it has. So I think faction is emerging. I think it's a way to engage young readers as well.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Dr. Mahaber, can you unmute Auntie Betty, please? I think she just re-entered the...
Yes, re-entered, but I'm not seeing her on the dashboard.
You're not seeing her on the dashboard.
Oh, yeah. Okay, she's here. I saw her.
Okay, good.
Right, so she's coming in.
Thanks.
So call on her. She's
Yeah, Auntie Betty, can you please unmute? Try to unmute now.
Unmute, Dr. Betty. Unmute. And you can turn on your video. She's probably having difficulty. Let's go to somebody else. Ranbir, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
Betty's here now.
Yeah, we're hearing you now.
You can turn on your video. Dr. Betty.
Yes, I had
Right.
to.
Yeah.
I had to go to my mobile because there's. I'm not being able. Anyway. On the question of.
Okay, you
of
have two
color.
devices on. Do you have two devices on now? There's an echo.
Turn the volume down on the one you're not talking into.
On the question of caste. Is that clear?
There's an echo.
No,
So you need
there's
to
an
turn
echo.
the
So on the
turn the volume
computer,
down.
Maybe if she just leaves the room, that might be the easiest thing. With the
If
phone.
she just leaves the room. Okay, so yeah, Auntie Betty, maybe you could just walk into another room with your mobile if you like. And you could continue to speak.
Let's take
Okay,
Ranveer.
can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
So there were distinctions among
Navin.
I think she has that on loud, so if she's
Shalina,
not
I'm
using her
happy to
laptop.
try and hazard an answer while Auntie Betty's audio is
Thank
being
you,
sorted
Joanne.
out.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question about a body of literature that may have its own name, Dr. Kumar, and we're just not there yet as South African writers. You might be interested to know Shevlin, Arvashni's, and my book are the first books to be published by mainstream traditional publishing houses in South Africa to do with indenture. So, essentially the books that preceded that, many of which Auntie Betty spoke about there, such as Aziz Hassam's The Lotus People, he also wrote The Revenge of Kali and others, and many authors like him in South Africa who are of Indian descent and who wrote about indenture were not able to have their books published by traditional publishers that have the greatest reach in the country. And so many of them simply self-published or published with very small indie publishers, independent publishers who did not have that reach. And as a result, those books, although they should have, were not given the opportunity to travel very far. And so not many South Africans actually know about the existence of those books, very sadly, and some of them are already out of print. So we do not have a sizable body, a canon of literature in this country, enough for it to have been studied yet. My book, for example, is only being prescribed at private schools, which are the wealthy, privileged schools in the country and account for a very small percentage of the actual schools in the country. The public schools in the country have not been able to access my book. The public universities have not prescribed the book. And so, you're getting a very niche group of people reading these books, unfortunately, which says to me that we need to work at making them more widely available in order for us to build up the knowledge of this body of literature. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that and for pointing out that there is a niche group. Now, there's a niche group that's interested in indentureship. There's a niche group that's interested in anything having to do with Indians. There's a niche group that even knows what the word Gurmatiya means. So it's important then to keep putting the information out there and to keep making it available for example, what we are trying to get established, which is Gurmatiyology studies. So thank you very much for that. Ranbir, you have your hand up.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry I arrived late. I missed at the time. I wasn't doing Indian time or anything like that. Joanne might have answered it already, but if anyone tried to publish even fiction on indentured labour during apartheid, would they have got away with like Jem Coatsy did, writing his own stuff, or would they got Nadine Gordimer treatment, getting their books banned? Would the books not even got published?
Ranbir, from what I know, the authors who preceded this generation, including Arvashni and Shevlin and me, were able to publish their books. They just didn't travel very far. And so I think they didn't pose much of a threat because the apartheid government wasn't aware of them. That is how I understand this body of writing. I may be wrong, and perhaps Auntie Betty will correct me on this, or Shevlin will. But the apartheid government, I don't think these books would even have come onto their radar. And therefore the fear of banning would not even have been an issue.
Okay,
Interesting.
great. So,
Shevlin.
So it's saying if there are white authors like Braden Batch or Nadine Gordimer, they have more chance of getting banned because they've got wider notes. Okay, well, I got it. Okay.
Right. Thank you for that. Shavlin, would you like to add anything?
No, I think Joanne covered it, Shalima, really well. I think I would agree with her. I think who posed a threat and what that threat looked like and where it came from, all of that. I don't think at that time that would have really, and had people been writing, and it would have been squashed very quickly, I suspect. But the truth of the matter is, I was born in 76, and a lot of I was very young, and by the time I was of an age of understanding, I'd like to say the war was over, but in terms of South African and the emergence of a new country, that was still a long way off. But so it's very hard to comment since we weren't, I guess, in the thick of it. And I suspect if somebody older on the call was living through it, they may have a more accurate understanding. But I'm in total agreement with Joanne there.
Okay, good. Thank you. Dr. Mahaber, you need to unmute Auntie Betty, please. Allow or allow her host capacity so
Yes.
she can unmute.
Yeah.
Thank you. Auntie Betty, can you speak now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Sure.
I wanted to say that there were some questions in the chat about Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee. And Gordimer was criticized for having in her earlier writings stereotypical Indian characters like shopkeepers and so on. There is a short story that she's written, A Chip of Glass Ruby, where the characters, the Indian woman character is struggle stalwart and works for the eradication of the pass laws. And J.M. Coetzee himself, in Disgrace, the character of Soraya is blurred. And so, as you know, racial categories are blurred in South Africa. And so that is an interesting creation of this character in Disgrace. But the other is that his work in vegetarianism, he himself is a vegetarian, and his work on the life of animals follows the Gandhian principles of ahimsa. And so he's influenced by this, which is, of course, universal and not just Indian. The other question, which is really worth considering, is whether the term coolie is derogatory. And we've had those debates in South Africa, and it's certainly, I can understand the concern in relation to the N word. And the coolie has been in many ways reclaimed as a reminder of the history of indenture. And so it hasn't been seen as a derogatory term as much as a reclaiming of that history of oppression. And so Gandhi was called the coolie barrister, and Dr. Gunam literally was called the coolie doctor, used initially as in a derogatory way, but she claimed it in a liberatory way. The question of caste is an important one. And so, because caste and class and race all worked in cahoots in oppressing Indians in South Africa, there was also internal, this is my observations, looking at living in communities in my family as well. So there were internal differentiations on the basis of caste, apart from language and religion. And yet, in so many ways, ironically, passenger Indians, people of high and lower caste, were all put together in the same ghettos and had to experience humiliating conditions across caste differences. So although there was some degree of internal caste discrimination in communities, there was generalized oppression that people shared. But I'd like to hear other views on this. This is my thinking on it.
Yeah. Well, we did have an entire program on caste already, eh? So you can probably go to YouTube and look at it.
Yeah, but you know, Dr. Mahabir, perhaps it's worth doing a program on this word, the coolie, because there are two sides of the argument. For
Yeah.
example,
Uh-huh.
I understand Pat's point. Pat has raised this on more than one occasion. I understand Pat's point, and I think persons to whom the word was directed in a derogatory way will have a degree of emotion that others will not. But, you know, for me, the word causes us to pause for a second to remember the identity of those indentures. We are not coolies now, and we
Right.
have to recognize that. But we do have to recognize that that's what they were called, just like they will label several other things. So in the same way as we can associate the word table with something that has 4 legs or 3 legs, we can also associate this word coolie with a person who came to labor. So I think we need to remember that this was a word that did indeed exist. We cannot remove it from our vocabulary. We must
Yeah.
recognize it
So
for
we
what
could consider it, but in some communities or societies or countries, Jamaica, St. Vincent and Grenada, it's the norm to say, hey, coolie boy, hey,
Yeah,
coolie girl. Yes, and
yeah. It's in
there is no
songs
stigma. Yeah.
as well. Yeah. But I do understand, I do understand those persons who feel quite hurt by the use of the word, and it just has to do with our association with it.
Yeah.
So
So we could think about it.
let's take Krishna's question or point. Krishna, your hand is up.
Yes. Sorry. First of all, I'd like to check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I have a comment. First, one that you made, Dr. Mahabir. Certainly, caste disappeared or was, diminished with the indentured workers. However, in South Africa, when I grew up there, and I left when I was 17, what I noticed was there was a great deal of linguistic differences and also geographical differences, geographical in terms of origin in India, north-south, and also the form or the practice, let's say, I give you one example of Hinduism, a North Indian Hinduism and a South Indian Hinduism. This influenced me personally when I was growing up, because I lived in a neighborhood where most of the people spoke a different Indian language. And, there was the attendant differentiation that did exist there. The other comment I have is with regards to J.M. Coetzee's work, Disgrace. The character Saraya in his particular novel there, I had always assumed that she was a mixed race when I read it. But the other thing is, I don't know if anyone has made the connection between Saraya and one of the male protagonists in that novel, who was a lecturer at the university, who actually,
Professor Lurie. Yes.
yes, he sleeps with Saraya. Okay.
Yes.
However, his daughter wants to get married for some convenient reason to a black man, and he goes through enormous emotional difficulties accepting that. That contradiction is, portrayed in the novel. Now, I know all about Salman Rushdie's criticism of the novel. I've read it. However, my personal opinion here is that J.M. Coetzee is revealing the hypocrisy of a certain type of South African.
Yes.
You know, that it's all right
Yes.
to sleep with a mixed race woman, but you go through emotional wranglings when it's the other way around, when the woman is white and the man is black.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something we can raise. As Shalima had indicated, we can do as another topic with these
Yeah,
coolie and the
thanks for
caste
that.
and the race. Yeah.
So we have a question from M. Webster for Shevlin. Shevlin, what emotional or personal cost did writing this story demand of you? And was there a point where you questioned whether you had the right to tell it?
Thank you, Shalima. I think that question requires an answer on a few levels, but I'm going to be as succinct as I can. I think I felt entitled because I wanted to find out more for myself. So that's where that initial journey began. It didn't affect anybody. I had the opportunity to find out. So there was that. And then there was the lives that we were leading as Indian South Africans, as a young girl growing up. And South Africa, at the time, I grew up in an Indian suburb. So all we saw, or all I was exposed to, was other Indians. And a lot of, as we were living through this, there were a lot of things that had pulled through from indenture. So you grew up in this what the UK equivalent would be like a council estate. You know, we were all low income families, all living in really small houses, and the vast majority of people worked in the shoe factories. It was a town where there were a lot of shoe factories that employed the Indians, and all the neighbors, your parents, all of that, they were all waking up early, going to the shoe factory, working late for pittance. Alcoholism, domestic abuse, patriarchal, religious, the rituals, patriarchy, all of that was still bleeding through. Women performing certain duties, expectations of girls, expectations from boys that were different. It was still playing out. So even though we were no longer living on sugarcane plantations and in barracks, we were still living those things out. So for me, it didn't feel far removed. I felt entitled yet again. And then I think the last piece that fell into place for me was immigrating to a country which I'd settled in, but to see how different that was, and to see or to be walking alone at night at 2 o'clock in the morning if I'd been out, or to take my children freely and not worry about just being alone with them, or just watching women in bikinis on the beach, not interested, and people would just walk past. Nobody was interested. So I saw what it played out in a reality, and then I saw the reverse of it. And then it all just sort of came together. This is a story I needed to tell. I hope I've managed to answer that question properly, but it was a melding of many things, in short.
Thank you for that. And I hope the M. Webster got a response. But something you just said is forcing me to rethink. When you were in South Africa, was it not okay for you to be able to walk at 2 a.m. in the morning? What would happen?
Not as a young woman. Certainly not not when we grew up. I don't even think when I was older. It just wasn't. It wasn't the done thing. It was not what young girls did, and perhaps that was imposed by our upbringing. There was that. It was not what a decent Indian girl should be doing. It was also within the norms of safety. And look, I had a fantastic childhood. Even within those constraints, had a fantastic childhood. But there were things that could have been better, like simple things like we never learned to swim. I don't know if you did, Joanne, but nobody ever really taught us, to swim. And why? I suspect because nobody prioritized that, as this is important. And considering how often we all went to the beach and how many children actually drown, you think that would be a priority. But it just was a society that placed value in different things. And I suspect a lot of that came back to maybe from India and then to the plantations, and then it just carried on. And then here we are now, breaking all of that, doing these things, writing these books, putting ourselves in places where we wouldn't have been accepted and welcomed or even invited. And so here we are. So within that, there's a journey.
Right. And having made the journey, having migrated, second migration or third migration in this instance is where you realize that life is different on the outside. Your experiences were not all the same.
Yes, and it's some of it's liberating, some of it's scary because you think, okay, I've got nowhere to hide now. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to have to do it on my own strength. There's nothing going to say, right, you can't do this and you can't do that, because you absolutely can. And you will be given a place at the table. But now the fear is, what am I going to say at that table? And is it going to be valid? And is it thought through, you know?
Yeah.
But it's all in steps. You have to take the steps. And that's what's important. But that last bit is to see what it's like. I've traveled quite a bit, and to just see the freedoms that people have elsewhere. You know, and nobody's interested. Nobody bats an eyelid about who's doing what to where. And I just think fantastic. I think that's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Joanne, we also have a question that's, I think, related. Your novel carries the emotional weight of a history marked by pain, displacement, and silence. How do you justify transforming generational trauma into fiction without risking its commodification for contemporary readers? And where do you draw the line between honoring your ancestors and utilizing their suffering as narrative material?
Sure, it's a complex and beautiful question, but I think it's a choice of evils, really. I mean, when Shevlin talks about silences, this is the reality, is that we had ancestors who were silenced. During apartheid, we continued to be silenced, as it was a kind of extension of colonization. And if we do not claim our voice in the canon, we will, or claim the right to have a voice and a canon, we will have none of those things. So you're weighing up the danger of moving into that area of romanticizing this, your ancestors' suffering, of perhaps appropriating it in certain ways, while you engage in the exercise of trying to give them the ability to talk back, as we're doing in some of these novels, you know, as Susan Laurie Parks has done with Sarah Bartman in one of our plays. But we also have to say that without appropriating our ancestors' stories, without allowing those stories to overwhelm us, as Marion Hirsch speaks about in post-memory theory, I think what Shevlin has spoken about in regards to the generational trauma, we know that trauma has traveled through generations into us. It has manifested in all sorts of ways, in physical illness, in mental health issues, in violence. And that has been carried down through generations. And we, as modern day Indian South Africans, have borne the brunt of that. Every generation has borne the brunt of that. And we do have the right to tell that story. We ought to be very careful in the way we approach it, and do so with respect to the memory of our ancestors. But the memory of our ancestors cannot be erased. It must remain in one form or another. I was asked this at a book launch of mine by an elderly Jewish lady in the crowd who said, I have no concept of how you have not recorded your history and made it known to everyone, because everybody in the world virtually knows about the Holocaust. And it made me realize that we have done a disservice to our ancestors by not being more vociferous in the past. And that in order to maintain this memory, and in order to fight back in the sense of memory being the weapon that one of our poets, Don Matera, writes of, we need to have these stories in the public domain. And if historical fiction is going to be the compromise vehicle for that, then I'm afraid we need to use it.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Don't go ahead. We have another question for you from Farhana. So Farhana is saying, from your book, she experienced an Indian identity as never before. Quite a compliment. How can we honor and preserve this identity, but focus on a more positive, expansive, and unified South African identity?
Thank you, Rahana, for that beautiful question. So firstly, I think you're absolutely right. I think we've all been walking around with holes inside of us because we've had this missing piece of history that has somehow been gouged out of us by the passing of time and the lack of ability to access the history of who we are. And it has, hearing the reports of how women of Indian descent in South Africa have received all of these novels, says to me that there's a certain kind of healing, there's a certain kind of closing of that gap, a partial closing of that gap by accessing our history. But I also think, having spent 3 hours yesterday afternoon with a group of African South Africans, Black South Africans, who showed great love for my novel, for which I was deeply, deeply grateful, I realized that this is not just an Indian story. It's not just an Indian South African story. This is the story of indenture is something that ought to slot neatly into a collective South African history. And that is what I've been calling for in public spaces. For us as a very diverse nation to start exploring our own histories, to create the spaces to mine those histories and to record those histories in various ways, and for us to explore each other's histories in a way that develops a kind of social cohesion and a deeper understanding of what each community is about. We are in desperate need of that in South Africa. It did not happen in 1994 as it should have, because we were not given the space to dialogue as a community. And I deeply believe in the power of literature to be able to get us to have those conversations, even about the hard stuff, but to be able to foreground those issues and create the platforms, create the vehicles for those conversations that take us to the next level as a more cohesive society.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Dr. Sita. Sita, are you here? Can you unmute? Sita, are you able to unmute?
Let me see if I see her. The dashboard.
Okay, so what Dr. Sita Shah Roth is saying.
Yeah, she's here.
Okay, I can unmute now.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. So I was
Yes.
just reading the comments in the chat, but I think you can go ahead and speak to it directly, and we'll take that last comment and clues for this evening. So go ahead, please.
So I was speaking about creative nonfiction. It's an emerging genre of literature where we take the historical, well, it's traditionally called historical fiction, but historical fiction does not distinguish between when you take facts, real events, and use the persons within those historical events and just change names of persons, perhaps, and you do use the collective experiences within the protagonist. And so what I've been doing is teaching a course that this emerging genre called creative nonfiction. So I've been teaching that course at the Institute of Creative Arts in Guyana. And so it gives our historical fiction more credibility in terms of the actual events and characters, experiences, how we write, whether it's violent. We use the real situations. We just sort of change the names of persons and do collective experiences rather than individual. So I just wanted to mention that new genre. The only drawback that I've discovered is that when it's entered for competitions, etc., it's just put aside because nobody knows where to put it in, because the genre is being taught at universities in the US too, which is where I actually got it from. And but it's now really accepted universally. And so the category within competitions also is missing. They just put it aside. No, it's not categorized.
So it still has to catch on then. Eventually it should, we assume.
Yes, but I can't, I'm sort of drawn to it. My students are, and we can't really, we continue, so.
Yeah.
It's
Good.
it's
So thank you
really,
very much for
it's like
sharing
a
then.
passion. It draws us and we want to write it.
Right.
That's a very good point. And hi.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Betty.
It's a very good point, and thank you for raising that, because I was just thinking of the way in which oral history is done. It's collecting factual information and storytelling from informants and presenting them almost as they are narrated. And I don't know if you know the Nobel Prize winner in literature, Svetlana Alexievich. She has written accounts of people she has interviewed, and just allows this free flow of narrative from the informant, and presents this as the narrative. So it's not fictional; it's really factual, and it's creative in the way in which it is presented.
Good, thank you for that. So to all the speakers, I just want to ask, the books that you've written and Dr. Betty, all the books that you've covered, would those be used to teach in any way Indian indentureship, or would they simply be reference books?
They could be used to teach. They could be used in a set works. It depends on the teachers, the creative bent of the teachers, and because they could be different departure points that one could use as a teacher with any of those texts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Joanne, Shevlin?
My book is largely being used as a literature book or an English set work. And there's only one history teacher brave enough that I know of who has used it as a tool to supplement the factual teaching of history, but it's because she's very, very experienced and is a former political activist. So her breadth of knowledge is extremely wide. And I think she's one of the few who probably has the skill to use historical fiction as a way of propping up the knowledge of children in terms of what they understand from a factual piece of writing in a textbook.
Thank you. Shevlin, English teacher's background.
I think it has a place. I've seen something remarkable done here in the UK where it's based on a thematic approach. So you have, the theme is identity. And so what we've done is, not me personally, I've delivered it, but it's part of the national curriculum here. There's poetry and there's extracts from different novels and different pieces that bring together this theme. And the children learn it, understand it, discuss it. And what it does is it brings together different perspectives on identity. So are they reading the book cover to cover? No, they're not. There's extracts from it, including extracts from other pieces of work. And again, why it works is because of the diverse range of text, because it's bite-sized, because it's themed, because it's accessible, and because it's topical. It ticks a lot of boxes. And I think, so we have power, we have another thematic approach, power, so you do some poems, you do some short extracts. And I think there's a place in my mind, there is something more about that, because if you're talking about something like diversity, you do want a range. You don't just want, Joanne said about, it's not just an Indian thing. If you think about if it's put into the South African curriculum, it's part of a South African story. That's what it is. And and I think there's merits in so many good work, pieces of work, and it'll be terrible to just say, okay, just that one tells the story. No, I think there's a few in different parts that tell maybe the part of one and the part of another, perhaps the life in India in the depot, then there's another bit, the journey of the ships, then there's another about life on the plantation. So I think there's something there, but it would require people at the higher levels to make that a go.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you very much. So I want to say thank you to you, to Joanne, to Dr. Betty, and to our speakers who are not here today, are Vashni, Luca, and of course Arti. Did I say Vishika? Sorry, Vishika and Arti. A very, very interesting conversation came out of it. And I just want to end with Mariam Natalwala's comment. She says, the opportunity to narrate, relive, and rewrite requires us to be in our hearts and minds. Therefore, re-speak and rewrite. A lovely way to end. Thank you all very much. Ashiria, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shalima. I loved your moderating today. Thank you all for being here until now. Today, we partnered with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Dabidi. Apart from sharing suggestions and donations, you can also contact us to publish your books. So, our topic next Sunday will be maintaining culture in the Indian diaspora. I want to thank our planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir and Shalima Mohammed. Thanks to our IT consultants, Daryl, Gransam, and Nevin Mangal. Check out our YouTube channel. And now I'm saying goodbye from Holland. Dhanyawad, everyone.